Okay, let's go.
Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm Stefano Gambati. I'm a political economist here in the Department of International Politics at CD. And tonight I'll be chairing this public lecture where Professor Lysandrou will present and discuss his latest book, Dollar Dominance, Why It Rules the Global Economy and How to Challenge It. Photis is a good friend of the department. He's actually one of the co-directors of our Political Economy Research Center, CDPERC. He is a seasoned scholar of global money and finance with countless publications on themes of financialization, financial crisis, global wealth inequality, tax policy, globalization, shadow banking, and more. He's authored a book on the genesis and operations of global financial markets, published in 2018 called Commodity, the Global Commodity System in the 21st Century, now a book on dollar dominance. In Commodity, Photis made a very compelling case for understanding financial markets not just as a natural outcome of the twin forces of globalization and deregulation, but as a distinct mode of production, one that is premised on producing debts as commodities, turning one's liabilities into another's assets. Now this production system requires a demand for as well as a supply of securities. In other words, it requires wealthy people on the one hand and powerful, more or less powerful, governments and corporations on the other hand. The production system also requires a global infrastructure, a platform, if you like, for producing and trading these securities. And this platform is made by banks and asset managers. Some colleagues have pointed out this global financial infrastructure began to emerge as early and form as early as in the 60s. But as Photis has highlighted in his work, this production system truly went into full gear starting from the 90s, and it's grown dramatically ever since. And this speaks directly to the topic of today's seminar, which is dollar dominance. Unlike what many at Cassandra predicted over the past 2 or 3 decades, the dollar has not really declined in power. In fact, it seems to have grown stronger. And this is because the dollar is the main key to access this ever-growing platform of global financial markets and play this endless game of finance, which is not just about paying and exchanging things, but it's about saving, investing, borrowing, and trading. So without further ado, I'll leave the floor to Photis, who will explain to us how the dollar continues to dominate the global economy and what we can do about it.
Thank you, Stefano. The summer of 1971 saw the end of the dollar-gold-centered Bretton Woods system. From that time down to the present day, there's been a steady stream of predictions that the dollar's days of international dominance are numbered. Although these predictions have always been met by arguments that dollar dominance will persist for the time being, the counter-arguments have never succeeded in cutting off the oxygen supply, keeping alive illusions to the contrary. The central purpose of my book is to cut off this oxygen supply. In so doing, the aim is not to condone or celebrate dollar dominance. On the contrary, it is imperative that that dominance be challenged by a rival currency, because the dollar is being increasingly used, especially so under Donald Trump's second term as US president, to mount a vicious assault on the world's population, on its resources, on its democratic institutions, with the overriding aim of promoting the interests of a wealthy few. But if the dollar's dominance is to be challenged, it is first necessary to understand the foundations of that dominance in the contemporary era. So where do we begin? The answer is financialization. The closing years of the 20th century saw not only the globalization of capitalism following the end of communism, but also its financialization following the expansion of the world securities markets to the point of dominating its product markets, where the world's broad money supply rose from around 65% of world GDP in 1980 to around 100% in 2000, and then to 140% in 2020, the corresponding growth figures for world securities volumes have been starker, in that where their aggregate outstanding value in 1980 was approximately $11 trillion, a sum on a par with that for world GDP in that year. By 2000, their aggregate value was about 2.5 times that for world GDP, a ratio that continued to be replicated through to the early 2020s, as you can see here. A fact just as striking as the huge volume growth of securities stocks is the hugely uneven geographical breakdown of their supplies. As you can see here, the US on its own roughly accounts for about 40% of all global fixed interest securities, bonds, outstanding, while all the emerging market economies, China included at the other end of this spectrum, account for around about an average of 13 to 14%. The same ratio breakdown also characterizes the global equity market. Now, these countries' percentage shares of world security supplies are directly reflected in their currency share of foreign exchange daily turnover volume, currently in the region of around 7.5 trillion. As you can see here, the US dollar at one extreme accounts for 44% of this volume, while all of the other emerging market currencies, that of China's included, comes to about 13%. Now, it's recognized that the foundations of dollar dominance are now finance rather than production related. But it is also believed that by virtue of being finance related, those foundations are fragile. The US is a large supplier of equities, but it is an even larger supplier of bonds. And the problem with this, when considering the large amounts of US bonds held by foreign investors, is that there may come a point when the latter abandon these bonds. This is Martin Wolf writing an article in the FT some 20 years ago. The US, he said, is now on the comfortable path to ruin. It's being driven along a road of ever-rising deficits and debt, both external and fiscal, that risk destroying the country's credit and the global role of its currency. Some 4 years later, two well-known international economists, Chin and Frankel, went on to predict that the dollar would lose its dominance by 2015, not only because the euro now exists as a more serious potential rival than the mark or yen were, but also because the United States by now has a 25-year history of chronic current account deficits, and the dollar has a 35-year history of trend depreciation. A year later, we find the doyen of international currency theorists, Benjamin Cohen, saying, "I do not consider the persistent build-up of America's foreign debt as sustainable for long. Unless reversed by significant policy reform in Washington, the dollar will become one of several peer competitors in a fragmented currency system with no dominant leader." Scroll forward to 2018 in the midst of Donald Trump's first presidency, and we find Ezra Prasad warning that Donald Trump's actions will end dollar supremacy. He agrees the sheer size of the American government and corporate bond markets is keys to the dollar's strength. But what does that strength come down to? Trust. Trust in US institutions is why the dollar remains strong. But this strength could prove fleeting if investors believed that reckless fiscal policies could heighten volatility and erode the dollar's value. In the statement that there is something subtler and more important that accounts for the dollar's status, it comes down to trust. The assumption is that there is nothing solid that ties foreign investors to the dollar, that there is no substance to dollar dominance. This assumption was made explicit by James Galbraith in an article published in the Institute of New Economic Thinking in May 2022, where he says, "Up to now, the dollar-based order has been held up by confidence in itself, and not, so far as one can see, by much of anything else." When Martin Wolf penned his article in 2004, warning that America was on the comfortable path to ruin, foreign investors held about 6.2 trillion worth of US securities. By 2008, that figure had grown to 8.9 trillion. By 2018, it had grown to 17.6 trillion. By 2022, it had grown to 23.2 trillion. There are the figures, the relentless increase in foreign holdings of US securities. So what is wrong? These figures show that there is something seriously wrong with current conceptualizations of the financial foundations of dollar dominance. That something is a failure to fully appreciate the impact of the institutional management industry. This has become, in many countries, a mass industry, catering for the retirement and other welfare arrangements of large sections of the population. And with this has come a corresponding growth in the need for assets in which clients' monies can be stored and from which monies can be extracted to pay clients. Although there are other types of assets that serve as stores of value for asset managers, pension funds, insurance companies, and the like, including cash and real estate, financial securities necessarily comprise the majority proportion of their portfolios because of their ability to combine a large value storage property with liquidity and portability. Asset managers have to hold the majority of their portfolios in the form of financial securities. And it is this binding portfolio constraint that explains why, through sheer lobbying pressure, they have forced the introduction of a new array of financial market rules and codes of behavior whose major aim is to enshrine the principle of shareholder investor primacy, the purpose of which in turn is to solidify the value storage capacity of securities. What is the rationale here? It is this. It's straightforward. As financial securities have no intrinsic value, it's only through their prices that they can acquire a quantitative value storage capacity. As these prices are nothing other than the discounted value of expected future cash returns, it follows that they can only remain solid enough to preserve a determinate quantity of value over time on condition that cash returns are made regularly. To ensure this regularity, institutional investors have forced the introduction of various governance, transparency, legal and other standards of conduct whose combined effects are to narrow down any discretion over cash disbursements to investors. What does this portend for the power of the dollar? As I said, everyone knows the power of the dollar today rests on the large size of the US's securities markets. But here's the question: what in the end are equity and debt securities? Answer: nothing other than promissory notes. Here's the next question: what has been the effects of the new financial standards and rules of behavior introduced under pressure from the asset management industry? Answer: it has been to transform financial securities from mere promissory notes, empty air, entities without substance, into tangible stores of value. From being particles without matter, securities have become particles filled with matter. And what this means is that when all the securities of our country's organizations are aggregated together, this aggregation gives that country's financial markets mass and a corresponding power of attraction for institutional investors. The greater the mass, the greater the power of attraction. And nowhere is this power greater than that exerted today by the US's securities markets. I've just said that the size asymmetries separating the US financial market from other financial markets are substantial. But substantial as they are nothing when compared to the size asymmetries when translated into currency terms. For where the dollar mass of securities exists as a single, same currency denominated mass of equity and debt securities, the financial markets of other countries, most notably those of the emerging market economies, shrink to vanishingly small fragments, in many cases to the size of plankton. What's the result? The key consequence of these size disparities is that the world's small financial markets are subject to the gravitational force of the dollar, trapped in its gravitational field, with international portfolio flows being the medium through which that force is exercised. What then of crisis, disorder, fracture in the context of dollar dominance? Answer: their cumulative impact is not to erode the foundations of dollar dominance, but to have the diametrically opposite effect of consolidating those foundations. Consider that the world's institutional investors need to hold the bulk of their portfolios in the form of financial securities, assets that can serve as safe and portable stores of value. Ever constant in normal times, this need becomes even more pressing in times of economic turbulence and ensuing uncertainty. And as the US is best placed to supply securities that can provide investors with safe value storage facilities on the scale required, it is this country that most benefits from any rise in international portfolio flows seeking safe harbor. Just look at 3 recent episodes of economic turbulence. Those accompanying the great financial crisis, the taper tantrum of 2013, COVID-19. What do you see? Massive outflows from the emerging market bond markets. Had nothing to do with them. Where did those funds go? Which country was the chief recipient? the USA. And this is what happens every time with every period of turbulence. So, who's going to challenge dollar dominance? Is it going to be BRICS in general or China alone? First established in 2009 and then expanded in 2010 to include South Africa alongside Brazil, Russia, India and China, this group has always had as one of its declared objectives the de-dollarization of the global financial system. Will BRICS de-dollarize the global financial system? In a study published in 2022, the answer given was yes, because BRICS' challenge to the US dollar's dominance lies in the group's collective economic power. BRICS accounts for 24% of world GDP and over 16% of world trade. Thus, BRICS' de-dollarization activities would not only impact inter-BRICS financial relations, but also create a ripple effect globally. Ripple effect globally has certainly been amplified by the reaction to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. For on the one side, that reaction has boosted a number of countries applying for membership of the BRICS Association. And on the other side, it has boosted BRICS' determination to expand the range of policy initiatives to help achieve de-dollarization. These initiatives include their development of cross-border payment system to rival SWIFT, development of a common BRICS payment system, and the establishment coordinated use of central bank digital currencies. What was the result of the announcement of these various initiatives over the course of 2022 and 2023? The answer is that the stream of de-dollarizations before Russia's invasion of Ukraine now became a flood. And here you see some examples of article headings in the Financial Times over 2022 into early 2023. We're going to see stealth erosion of dollar dominance, dollar's exorbitant privilege under threat. A bipolar currency regime system will replace the dollar's exorbitant privilege. Nuri Rubini, when he said that, you know what his prediction was? This is going to happen in 10 years. China's currency is going to become a real rival to the dollar. 10 years. Write that down if this is going to happen in 10 years. Gillian Tett was more circumspect, played both ways. Just prepare. It might happen, it might not. Better prepare for a multipolar currency system. We are not going to see a multipolar currency system. Why not? Let's go back to this ripple effect idea. Consider again that the combined share of all the emerging market economy currencies, including those of the BRICS groups, their share of daily forex turnover, 7.5 trillion, is 13%. If we subtract from that figure, right, transactions, EME currency transactions that involve either the dollar or the euro or some other advanced market economy currency as the counterparty currency, it turns out that the share of all cross-EME currency transactions comes to 3%. 3%. So even if the volume of non-dollar cross-EME currency transactions continue to rise, the starting base of this volume is so small that there will be no discernible impact on the dollar. The current situation is that the dollar's dominance stems from the size gap separating the US's financial markets from all other markets. Unless and until this gap is closed, there will be no end to that dominance. And as things currently stand, there are only two areas with the potential to grow their financial markets to a size commensurate with those of the US, the Eurozone and China. Of these two, it might seem that China is the one more likely to realize this potential. Russia and many other allies of China may well believe that China is seriously aiming to eventually dethrone the dollar. And China may well encourage this belief, or at the very least, do nothing to discourage it. But its real aim in promoting the internationalization of the renminbi is not to de-dollarize the global financial system, so much as to help cement foreign markets and foreign resource supply systems to China's industrial base. China certainly wants to lead the East in challenging the US and the West's power in the world trade and industrial realms. But this challenge entails working from below and leaving the dollar's dominance up above unchallenged. If there is ever to be any serious challenge to the dollar, it has to come from the euro. A monetary union in the contemporary era of financialization serves two distinct economic functions: an internal efficiency-enhancing function in the sense that such a union between countries eliminates exchange rate volatility as a key impediment to their closer trade and production integration. The other function, the second one, is an external protection-enhancing function in the sense that monetary union provides a sheltering hub both against global financial pressures in general and against the gravitational force of the dollar in particular. The dilemma that faced the architects of the Eurozone is that these two distinctive functions of monetary union pull in completely opposite directions as regards its optimum size. For where the internal efficiency enhancing function is served, the better, the smaller is the number of the member countries of the Union. The external protection enhancing function is served, the better, the larger is the number of member countries. When the Euro planners were planning for the introduction of Euro in the course of the 90s, something changed in the middle of that decade. Up to about 95, 96, they were planning for a small Eurozone area to begin with. 5 or 6 countries, principally drawn from Northern Europe. After the mid-90s, they changed direction and allowed all applicant countries, bar Greece, into the Eurozone. Greece was eventually allowed in 2002. What was the reason for this change of direction? And the answer is the financialization of capitalism, resulting in a rise in the lethal combination of capital market mobility with capital market volume. The 1970s may have seen the end of capital mobility constraints following the end of the Bretton Woods system, but it was still a decade of small capital market volume. Recall that even by 1980, world security stocks only amounted to 11 trillion, a sum on a par with world GDP. Only from the mid-90s onwards do you start to see a rapid increase in global security supplies. It was from rapidly outpacing world GDP growth, as I said. Now, the world's large institutional investors would have welcomed the growth of security stocks because it represented a growth in the supply of portable stores of value. But the flip side of this development was that it provided hedge funds and other speculative vehicles with huge financial firepower when targeting national currencies that were perceived to be vulnerable. Europe felt the scale of pressure that can be exerted against exchange rates in the summer of 1992 with the EMS crisis. But if there was then any lingering doubt as to whether this type of pressure was likely to be temporary rather than permanent in nature, that doubt was ruthlessly removed by the Asian currency crisis that broke out in the summer of 1997. It was about then that the European Commission started to give greater priority to the euro's role as a protective hub against global financial pressures, and hence to start thinking of a large rather than small euro from the outset. So what is the euro? A qualified success. The success, it's large enough, the eurozone is large enough to give some protective shelter against the gravitational force of the dollar. The qualification, the eurozone is not large enough to rival the international role of the dollar, to give the euro that strength. In fact, on this issue of size of currency mass, the eurozone is going backwards. When the euro was introduced in hard currency form in 2002, its percentage share of daily forex turnover was about 19%. Today, it's down to 15%. This decline correlates with the EU's and the eurozone's percentage share of global bond supplies. 2013, the EU share of total global bond supplies, 28%. By 2022, fallen down to 17%. What were the two reasons for this decline, which then affects the euro against the dollar? Number one is the European corporations' continued reliance on bank loans as opposed to bonds as their principal form of external debt financing. As you can see on the right-hand side there, look at the contrast, quite sharp. But the second and probably more important reason for the euro's decline is the German government's attitude to government debt, which I'm happy to say over the last few days, not even weeks, under the influence of Trump, is beginning to change. But what has been the view of the German government on debt? It has used its position as the most powerful EU and Eurozone economy to persuade EU, Eurozone member state government to keep strict controls on government debt. As regards the Eurozone in particular, it has led, up to now that is, opposition to the idea of joint Eurozone government-issued bonds. The result has been that the Eurozone area has been starved of supplies of information-insensitive government bonds that can serve as the safe haven, stabilizing core of the Eurozone financial markets in the same way that US Treasury bonds do in the US dollar financial markets. Look again at the size of the dollar mass of securities. Now look at its inner composition. Of the 90 trillion total stocks outstanding in 2022, 26 trillion at the core were US Treasuries and agency bonds. Those bonds act as the glue holding together the other securities markets into a single compound mass. So, finally, why should the euro challenge the dollar? The global economy is now an operational totality, tightly integrated along various dimensions, financially, technologically, and so on. And yet, there are no global institutions with powers of intervention and correction, leading to what I call a global institutional deficit. As things currently stand, the only global institutions that have any connection to the running of the global economy are either those that set down and umpire common standards and rules of conduct, the BIS in the sphere of banking, WTO in the sphere of trade, are two examples, or that provide countries with heavily conditioned financial assistance to help them function in line with prevailing standards and rules of conduct. The IMF and World Bank are notable examples. But we are at a crossroads now. Either we correct for the current global institutional deficit by adding to the existing global institutions new ones that are equipped with the same interventionist powers of correction and redistribution as have national governments, or we go backwards and either destroy or neuter the existing global institutions. This is the essential core of Donald Trump's program in his second term of office as the US President. Outside of the Eurozone, there are many other countries in the world with a similar degree of political plurality as in Europe and the Eurozone that allow cause for radical policies and for radical institutional change to be made. But none of these countries have the power to leverage up international support for these causes, because in the current era of financialization, power means currency power, and none of them have this type of power. It's because the Eurozone is unique in that it is a regional area comprising of many countries with many political parties, while also having just one common currency that explains why it is in the best position to lead calls for radical change. Now, I'm not an idiot. I am not saying that the Eurozone is about to make these calls anytime soon. As things currently stand, as we all know, the electoral sway of political parties, such as in Germany, France, Italy, that are pushing forward highly populist and divisive policy agendas, is as marked in the Eurozone as in the US and elsewhere. Yet while this is the situation today, the situation may possibly change tomorrow as political parties pushing forward unifying and progressive policies again gain ascendancy. And it's this possibility that explains why the international role of the dollar must be considerably strengthened. In the end, what I'm saying is that when at some point in the future it becomes obvious that the world's national governments will no longer be able to contain the manifold destructive effects of increasing global economic inequality, and that any realistic hope of dealing with those effects requires the creation of a new global institutional architecture, a strong euro with enough international power that can match that of the dollar offers the best chance of meeting that requirement. That's all.
This. So we now have 40 minutes? Yes, roughly 40 minutes. Just for your information, we are recording this lecture. I'm going to take now questions from the audience, 3 questions at the time. I'm going to try and have as many rounds as possible, so if you can be concise in your questions, that'd be great. And the floor is open.
Let's start with Bruno. In my office, you were bombarding me with questions.
I forgot that Photis also likes to chair the session as well as be the speaker. I see somebody raising their hand. Yeah.
Let me come to Bruno's help, and Bruno can ask you after. So the Eurozone is in a kind of quite specific situation right now, right? So there is this push to spend more, particularly on defense, right? At the same time, there's lots of kind of right-wing populism popping up, as you said. Do you think there is a chance, given financialization, that governments like Germany come together and like others across the Eurozone and basically decide to finance both defense but also more social expenditure, which is what's really needed, right? Like the total kind of underinvestment in social infrastructure in general. It's one of the reasons why the right-wing populist sentiment is so strong. And if we don't contain that, then we basically kind of have an even bigger problem at hand than we already have now.
I didn't quite understand your point about Donald Trump. What you saying that he has an interest in destroying the current system, or is he actually promoting the system, trying to support it? My sense would be actually the latter, or looking at his support for asset management. I would assume that he has an interest in retaining the system, but I would be curious what your intuition is.
Could you say something about what you see the role for the digital or cryptocurrencies might be in all of this?
Let's start with those three. You wish. Yep.
Didn't hear any of those questions.
Let's start with Ava's point about governments are being pushed to spend more on defence. Where's the money going to come from? Obviously, there's going to be restrictions on how much debt governments can increase, and therefore there will be cuts in welfare, infrastructure, and so on. What do you see Donald Trump doing globally? On the one hand, he's pushing for increased defence expenditure, a lot of which means more exports of arms from the US, which is good for the US. On the other hand, he has pulled out US corporations from the OECD's global corporate tax agreement. Global corporate taxes are going down in a race to the bottom. There's been an attempt in recent years under OECD auspices, supported by over 160 governments, to try and set a minimum and even raise it. Trump is trying to destroy that. My argument here is what we need to see. If governments are going to spend more on defence, they have to finance this by broadening their tax base. What we're seeing across Europe, in the UK and elsewhere, is base erosion of the tax base. All the tax falls on immobile agents, small businesses and households, while the mobile element, corporations and the super rich, are not paying their tax share. Governments are therefore being starved of funds and pushed into a corner, right, of having to make cuts in order to increase defence spending. And we're seeing it here as well as in Germany and so on. Unless this is addressed, of course, the far right are going to come in and say, look what's happening, jobs are disappearing, immigrants are taking our jobs because we're spending money on immigrants, money we don't have. And this is, as Eva says, a key problem. What is Donald Trump's main aim to answer, Inga? We have at the moment global institutions that have a limited remit, partly because of the US, a remit of simply umpiring rules and so on. No real redistribution or intervention. Even this limited remit, he wants to undo. Right? Even the minimum they're doing in terms of rules, regulation, he wants out. So look at it. Taking the US out of the COP agreements, right? Number one, right? Cutting international aid, number two. Taking the European corporations out of the OECD corporate tax agreements, number three. Do you know what his next target is? WTO, right? Everyone asks me, and I'm sure someone's going to ask me, this is me preempting the question, why is he engaging in tariff wars? Why the tariffs on Canada and Mexico, thereby destroying the NAFTA agreement? Right? He's going for the WTO. In 1944, at Bretton Woods, you had the IMF formed and you had the World Bank. There should have been the International Trade Organization. But the International Trade Organization never saw the light of day because of US opposition. Instead, we had GATT, General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, informal round of tariff negotiations. In 1995, we have the World Trade Organization, permanent standing body whose remit was expanded outside of tariffs to include non-tariff barriers in the area of finances, in the area of technology, proprietary rights, and so on. Yes? Why did America agree to the WTO formation in 1995? Because at that time it was scared of Japan, competition from Japan and Asia. And at that time, the dollar wasn't as strong as it is today. Now that the dollar is very strong, he's going for the WTO. Why? Because the giant US corporations, the tech companies, Amazon, Facebook, they don't want rules and regulations about what they can and can't do. He's going for the WTO. You know what these tariffs are all about? Canada's gone to the WTO saying what you've done is illegal. WTO is going to go to the US and Donald Trump saying what you've done is illegal. What is Donald Trump going to say to that? I'm not going to say it because we're being filmed. You know? So he is stripping out that. Cryptocurrencies. The question is, are cryptocurrencies going to change the reserve system and bring down dollars and so on? No. Cryptocurrencies are there and they're being promoted, apart from self-enrichment of Trump and his followers. They're being promoted to promote alternative means of financing trade and exchange. So if you take the East, the cryptocurrency, central bank digital currencies, now being introduced by China and so on, this is to facilitate more trade between these countries. Inside the US, cryptocurrencies are being used to finance more transactions and so on. But they are not going to displace US Treasury bonds as the primary reserve asset, because to have reserve asset today, in the face of huge financial flows, you need an asset that combines large value storage capacity with safety and liquidity. Cryptocurrencies have value storage capacity, they have liquidity, but they don't have safety. Cryptocurrencies do not have behind them a backing mass of anything. They rely on trust between counterparties. And I'll tell you something, it's because of that that the likes of Elon Musk and so on can manipulate cryptocurrencies. What did Musk do a year and a half ago? Didn't he announce he was going to buy a certain coin? Eh? His announcement sent that sky high, the price, didn't he? Which he had. What did he do the next day? He sold them and made millions. They are speculative in nature. They are not going to be anything that's going to challenge or undermine dollar dominance. Next.
Thank you. After 1971, you talked about the gravitational pull of the dollar being incredibly strong.
Yeah.
But in the pie diagrams, I mean, the dollar is still only accounts for about 37–40%.
Yeah.
And the 60% isn't. And I thought, if there's all this gravitational pull,
Yeah.
why isn't the dollar more significant than 37–40%? Well, why isn't it 60–70%? You would think it would be.
Well, you're talking percentages, yeah? Now let's look at figures.
Shall we take? There's another question as well.
Okay,
Shall we take
okay.
another question
All right.
first?
You're right.
I think is gentleman, no? Right. You do, yeah.
Why is the dollar, the BIS started its reports on foreign exchange turnover in 1986. And then the amount of foreign exchange turnover in 1986 was minimal, less than $500 billion. And ever since, there's been 3-year reports. And throughout that time, the US dollar accounts for when they say 88%, it's because every currency pairwise transaction is counted for both ends, so you get out of 200%. So to make things simple, I've divided by 2. The US has always been 44%. So why am I saying its power is growing, even while its percentage share is the same? And the answer is, look at the absolute figures. Look there, as I indicated earlier, you had an increase of world security stocks volume relative to world GDP. Now look at the reserves matching the growth in security stocks in general. in 95, barely 1.5 trillion. By 2017, we're 12 trillion. Today, 13.5 trillion. Reserves are growing in volume, and which is the major proportion of that? You talk about 60%. Well, in reserves, it's around 60% dollar of reserves that have grown in volume. You see? Now, Eichengreen and the IMF, this really annoys me. They say in the year 2000, dollars reserves were over 70%, and they're now under 60%, so we're seeing a trend decline. There has been no trend decline. In 2002, there was a sudden dip with the introduction of the euro in hard currency form. And from 2002 to today, it's been around 60%. No trend decline, no stealth erosion of dollar dominance. The dollar rules.
Is that not a trend decline?
No. I don't see a trend decline if you take from around 1960, around here, go forward. It went from 60 to 59. Today it's 58%. It's not any appreciable decline. And now, here's the real question. Are we likely to see further declines because of diversification into cryptocurrencies, into alternative currencies like the Australian dollar, the Canadian dollar? And my argument is no. Because if you take these alternative reserves like the Australian or Canada or whatever, they're too small. They may be safe, they may be liquid, but they don't hold enough value. When you have speculative attacks at you, at a currency, by the billion, as against the Asian currencies in 1997, right? How are you going to stave off this surge coming against you? How do you stave off an ocean wave coming onto the wave? What do you do? What are you going to have? Paper napkins? Hey? What are you going to use? Australian dollar reserves, which are tiny? I mean, this is seriously Barry Eichengreen saying, oh, we're seeing central banks diversify to Australian dollar and all that because they offer better returns than the US. But I thought, is this man serious? Lewis.
Sorry, I meant just to...
Go ahead, go ahead.
I think, well, I'm not by Green, obviously, as you just pointed out. I think Barry's point is heavily covered by his work on the gold standard and its relationship to empire. And actually, what you're talking about is the dollar and its relationship to the American empire. So maybe the discussion needs to be widened out into a geopolitical framework rather than simply now an economic framework.
Shall I answer that or have more
If
questions?
there are also other questions, Harold?
A slightly more nuanced one about the gravitational pull.
Go ahead.
You mentioned quite a few times FX daily volumes,
Yes.
some of which is speculative, so it's just someone has a position in the morning and in the afternoon they've closed it. But is your point that the level of trading provides liquidity that, for instance, is useful with a flight to quality when there's a crisis? There are markets that you can easily go into. So I just wondered if you could expand a little bit more on the power of the gravitational force.
Right. If we take the breakdown of the
Let's
FX,
see first if there might be a third question. Yes.
this is a father-son act. Why are you standing up?
It's going to be a long question. Maybe.
Sorry, I'm an academic, so it's natural. I want to make 2 points, Photis. I'm aware I'm speaking as somebody operating in the field of international relations, which is sometimes characterised as high-grade journalism, but economics is also got its critics, but I'm assuming that the majority are economics. I want to make 2 points, Photis, one of which I think you will find supportive, and the other one I think you'll find a bit more critical. I think the supportive point I wanted to make is the following parallel. you talk about the dollar as having a power of its enormous size and stability and roots. I want to, in a sense, underline that by indicating that at the turn of the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a whole question about whether a new European security order could be constructed. And in the event, nothing was constructed. NATO became, in a series of progressive enlargements, de facto the only game in town. The reason for that is quite simple. Its size, its stability, you can't reinvent easily large institutions with huge constituencies in the way that the NATO has secured. So, in that sense, I'm reinforcing your point that the United States dominance has been a function in part of its size and its stability and its institutional strength. My query is your second area. I agree with you on BRICS and China. They're not going to be, in my view, for what it's worth, much of a query. My query is about the EU. You didn't say much, in fact, about the EU itself, and I find it difficult to envisage the Eurozone and its financial institutions separate from the totality of the EU. And the EU is not in a good place right now. It's not growing, it's not expanding, it's not healthy. Draghi, I want to suggest, I understand he's an economist of some sort, wrote a report, which is not a great one, on the great future behind it for the Europe. Its position in the world, relatively, I don't want to go into figures, is diminishing. So I'm finding it difficult to comprehend how you envisage a weak and declining regional structure, which still has enormous attractions, certainly, as the basis for an ousting of a very powerful, long-standing institution. That means rather bleak future that the dollar is, in my judgment, therefore, likely to be, all things being equal, a very powerful force. Unless, of course, one thing which is never looked at sometimes, the internal evolution of the United States, in societal terms and others, begins to implode, and that will have a sort of corrosive, damaging impact on the United States as a beacon and as a stable institution deserving of respect. So in those terms, J.D. Vance's criticism of the European culture and the woke as a basis for its weakness, it may be that in the future, who knows, we have the future is by definition unknown, that the United States may begin to lose its primacy, not because of its financial or military structures and power, but rather because of its own internal disintegratory process. Thank you very much.
Well, let's start with the comment you made there about the Eurozone. I recognise the problems within the Eurozone area, as in the EU wider. It's not easy bringing governments together. The EU is the only example on the planet where governments have pooled a certain amount of their sovereignty. The only one. And the Eurozone is the only area where they managed to create a common currency despite all the difficulties. Guess who hates all this the most? Trump and those around him. They do not want any supranational authority because they know the only way the power of US corporations can be challenged today is if governments come together. If governments stand alone and currencies stand alone, they can pick you off one by one, right? You will have to run to them and bow a scrape, just the UK in many senses is currently doing. You're powerless unless you have some kind of unity standing in the way, right? That's the problem. When Vance went to give his speech, when he went to Germany, who did he see? He did not meet the then Chancellor Scholz. He met with the deputy leader of the far-right party. Why? Because that party is against the euro. It wants Germany to exit the euro. That's what they want, a breakup of the euro. And my argument in this book is the only possible currency that can rival the dollar and create space for for any kind of movement going forward. In answer to Pat's point, if you take the foreign exchange market today of 7.5 trillion, half of that is FX swaps, pairwise exchange of currencies, which are pre-agreed between two parties. You can't use them to speculate. They're used to manage exchange rate risk and so on. That's followed, FX swaps are then followed by outright forwards. No one speculates on outright forwards because the outright forward market is very thin, stretched across time. So all of the speculation is concentrated on spot market, which is about the third of the total. If you take the spot market third of the total, you're right, hedge funds, companies like your previous one, will trade the same pair of currencies 40 times a day to extract any value. But, so you have a base of the spot market transactions which are for legitimate purposes, but there will be amplification through speculation. Quite right.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Stefano.
And the
You
question
haven't answered this question here.
oh, right.
Which one?
There was one question by the gentleman.
Oh, yeah, about the geo... Was it a question on observation? What was... Remind me of the questions.
I was trying to argue that by Eichengreen's,
Oh, about the gold standard.
and the fact that the pound, which again you mentioned,
Right.
the pound before 1918,
Yes.
Eichengreen was mesmerised by that as the underpinning.
Ah, yes,
of the
yes.
gold standard.
I do have...
And you could argue the same, the dollar, even in the Bretton Woods period and even post-Bretton Woods.
Okay.
You've got the Pax Britannica, the Pax Americana,
Good.
and it continues since the mess
Right,
of
right.
1988.
Right. In my book, what I say is that one of the arguments about why dollar dominance persists, despite the fact that its production basis and trade basis decline, is the argument of inertia. And Barry Eichengreen is one of those I quote in his book who argues that the pound did not lose its preeminent position as was number one currency in 1914, by which time it had lost its industrial supremacy. It only lost it in 1945, when the US decided to face outwards and assume leadership of the Western world. So many people, including Eichengreen, including the group of authors that produced that pamphlet, Can BRICS De-Dollarize Global Financial System, have used the inertia argument, that we're going to see the dollar decline over time when other countries or groups like BRIC make a determined assault on it. Why? Because the production base, the trade base of the dollar has weakened. The central argument of this book is that history has no lessons for today, because we're seeing a new paradigm shift without any historical precedent, and that is the financialization of the global economy. At no point in the world's history have global securities markets ever dominated to such a degree as today, and that will continue. Why will it continue? Because on the corporate side, issuing securities, you have increasing pressures of competition, technological change. What is happening on the government side? They're facing new pressures, socioeconomic pressures. Number one, demographic change. The world is aging. The birth population's gone through 7.5 billion. The main driver of birth population is not birth numbers, it's aging. Dependency ratios are going up. Governments are under pressure. They have to issue more and more bonds in order to make ends meet. They are, what I'm saying, colonizing the future to escape the pressures of the present. There's no historical precedent to that. So looking in the past to see what happened to the pound and saying it's going to happen to the dollar is useless, meaningless.
I'm going to try my luck. As you know, I'm really on board with your understanding of the power of the dollar. The fact that the dollar gives you access to this massive pool of financial US dollar denominated securities markets. You also mentioned the derivatives markets, which is as relevant when it comes to pricing commodities and securities and so on. Now my question to you is, the policy implication is for the euro and the eurozone to develop a financial market that has similar qualities of the US financial market. So grow the European capital market. Not just grow the capital market in size, but grow it in its liquidity, trading volumes, and so on. So
Yeah.
make it look like the US, more like the US capital market.
It has to, yeah.
It has to. But that involves giving more prominence to the activities of big market makers, alternative investment firms, the hedge funds that you were blaming at one point in the lecture for creating instability, private equity, venture capital, all this array of funds which are highly leveraged, which are a force of growing wealth inequalities as well, growing the wealth and portfolios of the rich. And so I'm wondering, is that the price to pay to rival the dollar to develop that kind of capital market? If not, how can you compete and create a market that has those trading volumes, is as liquid?
Okay.
And one last point, given the fact that US Treasury bills are the safe asset at the heart of the US financial markets, we should, in Europe, develop a European bond market on, a sovereign bond market. But based on what you were saying, what others were saying as well, it looks like the only way to do this is by increasing military spending right now, in a context where the taxability of the rich is sort of very limited. And so all this money will also fuel not the welfare, but the enemies of the welfare. So we fight the dollar by creating an equal monster. Is that the solution to the problem?
Stefano's line of reasoning leading up to his question illustrates the problem, as I said, that many people on the heterodox wing of the profession have, which sees financialization, the growth in the scale of the financial markets, as an aberration, as a deviation from the norms of capitalism. My argument is that we take a phenomenon, its development, and distinguish what is functionally necessary from what is dysfunctional. The growth in the scale of the financial markets led by the US has functionality in general because of the asset managers and so on. The dysfunctional outgrowth is the speculative activities and institutions like hedge funds, private equity. Separate the two. If you lump them together and say financialization scale is bad because it's all speculation, rentiers, where do you end up? You end up with unilateral disarmament in the face of dollar power. This is the problem with the euro. Don't copy the Americans. Let's have, for example, European corporations. Don't issue bonds. That's not American. That's bad. Bonds are traded. You can have all kinds of crooks and hedge funds trade them. Stick with bank loans. Banks, it's cozy, it's relational, right? This is nonsense. What happens? In the US corporation, 20% of all their external debt funding is banks, 80% with bonds, right? Long-term bonds, 2, 5, 10, 20 years, okay? Look at the Eurozone, Europe. 80% of their external debt is banks, right? Not just short-term, but long-term. What are you doing? You're tying up banks' balance sheets in Europe, right? Long-term. How can they give loans to small businesses and households, especially in crisis? You're tying them down. You can't allow them to compete with the big American banks. See, That's one reason. That's one problem. The point is to separate out what is it about finance that we can accept, the scale, and what is it that we must legislate against, control. I've argued for controlling, even abolishing hedge funds, controlling private equity. I have never argued for definancialization. I have never argued try to roll back, put the genie in the bottle. It's not going to happen. And if you do that, you are weakening what you're doing against the dollar. What sustains the dollar in? You saw that graph, 90 trillion, 26 trillion US Treasury bonds. Who holds those Treasury bonds? 1/3 of those US Treasury bonds are held by foreign investors. Not just central bank reserves, foreign investors. Right, 1/3. You know what foreign investors keep complaining when they say, go away from the dollar? Oh yes, I'm a Japanese pension fund. I want to leave the dollar, but where am I going to go? Where am I going to put my foreign investments in? There's not enough Eurozone assets. There's not even enough Eurozone assets for Eurozone banks. Eurozone banks hold 10 times as many dollar assets as US banks hold Eurozone assets. All large banks have to hold internationally currency denominated assets to match their liabilities. Here are the Eurozone banks relying on dollar assets far more than the real. What's the result? That the ECB relies on swap lines with the Federal Reserve far more than the Federal Reserve relies on the Eurozone. Imagine if Trump says to the next president of the Federal Reserve, which could be an ex-hedge fund manager, Waltz, imagine if he says, why are you giving the ECB all these dollars so cheaply? If he were to do that, the Eurozone banking sector will go into crisis because there are not enough German government bonds to use as collateral. So what are they using? Dollar as collateral. It's criminal. Criminal. Yes, we have to go in the direction of financialization, or there will be no challenge to dollar. And yes, I understand your concerns about private equity and hedge funds. You're right. Separate the two. What is functional and what is dysfunctional? That's what must be done.
I think Photis wins 10-0. And we can all call it a day and have a round of applause.
Let's go and drink. Which are dedicated to the memory of Tony. So I'm going to make sure. I mean, very good. It's up to him. Why did you not tell Rigas about Tony? And the guys you saw are exclusive. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very Let's go now. Some say him says I can't come with my dad being there. Somewhere there, yeah, just from there. Yeah. You can have a glass of wine. Hey, you can ask me
Someone asked it anyway, right? What Trump's effect is going to be on all this story. Basically, whether Trump would undermine.
Well, stock
Well, I think
I don't think stock camera is that keen on stock. He's keen on models, not stock camera.
Mind you, I want to do that here as a seminar. Then, where will we go?
But I'll see you on Monday, yeah?
Yes, as we said.
Where's the drink?
Just straight ahead.
Straight ahead.
When you came up the stairs, it's up, on this, the drinks are under, they're under a portrait of Malcolm Gillis.
But it's under this,
At this same level. Can't miss it.
And you're coming here to show here.
I'll meet some.
Because tomorrow I will be elsewhere. We've already discussed that, and you were.
One of you plan to be there with the other.
We can just because of my thing is 6:30. I don't want to rush. It's sharp at 6:30. They finish every day. I want to be able to do the socializing. And also, I think that when you buy a coffee, just they told me to buy a standard there, and I don't know what that stands for because when I go to see the website, it doesn't say standard. It's just like. Because I can also buy the option that you can restore.
No, you're just outside. And then it's got some mad.
Yes.
Actually, but we're outside the peripheries, so we went for 3 days.
I mean, when we stay, I
tell you, it's a Greece, even photos of it. And they can't say
I mean, I need some people with the
Let's have a drink now.
Are you going to come to the pub?
No, I think I'll head home as well, actually.
I was going to introduce you to some people.
I mean, how do you like?